The first time I saw that room, the lights were too bright. Cold, flat light on white walls on stainless steel on a clear box that looked like it belonged in some museum instead of a lab. The air in there felt wrong to me, too. Dry, too filtered, carrying a faint sweetness that didn't belong in a place built for facts and measurements. There was a table in the middle, and on it, beneath layered glass, lay something small and curved and amber, like a piece of polished bone sealed under ice. A gloved hand moved slowly above it, the latex whispering against glass, tracing shapes only he could see. Somewhere behind me, a machine clicked and hummed in a steady rhythm, like a slow mechanical heartbeat. I remember the smell most of all, honey and smoke-thin but unmistakable, floating over the metallic tang of disinfectant. No one spoke louder than a murmur, as if the air itself might shatter. And there, in that cold, humming silence, I realized I already knew that smell from somewhere else. Let me know where you're listening from, and hit follow if you think remembering is its own kind of justice. Back then, before any of that, my world was a lot smaller than it feels now. It was morning traffic over wet pavement on I-5, the muted thump of wiper blades when the drizzle turned to real rain, the hiss of espresso machines in the coffee shop below my office. I'd sit at my desk, the glow of the monitor bleaching the color out of the room, and look at drainage plans and retaining wall details while the faint hum of the HVAC rattled through the ceiling vents. Seattle in August can still surprise you with a chilly breeze off the water, but that particular summer had settled into a warm, steady pattern, clear blue sky by mid-morning. Dry sidewalk sun glinting off the Sound like bits of glass. In those days, my phone lived face down beside my keyboard, vibrating now and then with emails, contractor questions, and every so often a text from my younger sister. A crooked photo of wildflowers, a mountain ridge dusted with snow, a trail sign pointing toward some place I'd never seen. Hannah's life moved to a different rhythm than mine. While I drove between job sites and city offices, she spent her days walking the grounds of office parks and private estates, kneeling in dirt, sketching planting beds on a yellow pad already creased with soil. At night, she'd call me from her little house on a tree-lined street north of downtown, the sound of passing tires on wet asphalt faint through her open window. You could hear the wind chimes on her porch tapping gently against each other when the evening breeze came in off the Sound. She liked to talk through her designs out loud, pacing barefoot across the wood floor, describing the way a certain kind of grass moved when the light hit it, or how a low stone wall could make a cramped yard feel like a tucked-away courtyard. There was always something earthy in the background, with her potting soil, wet leaves, the sharp green smell of cut stems drying in a bucket. Our families are rarely as even as we pretend they are. I was the one who stayed close to the beaten-path college, a job, a condo with a predictable mortgage, and a parking spot that always belonged to me. Hannah was different. She liked maps more than calendars, trail guides more than restaurant menus. She kept her backpack hanging by the front door year-round, already half-packed, the faded nylon straps, soft from use. When I'd visit, I'd see topo maps spread out on her kitchen table beneath a ring of coffee from her mug. Little pencil marks along ridge lines and creek crossings. In the corner of the room, her boots weighted by the baseboard still dusted with some other mountain's dirt. She'd talk about Glacier like most people talk about a favorite old movie. Lines memorized, scenes replayed in her mind, the smell of cold air and resin as familiar to her as the sound of her own footsteps. That August, the city held on to the heat. Mornings started cool, sure, but by the time I got out of a meeting and onto the sidewalk, the sun would already be bouncing off the glass towers downtown, warming the back of my neck. The ferries moved back and forth across the water like patient white beetles, their horns low and mournful over the slap of waves against piers. Sometimes on my lunch break, I'd walk down to the waterfront just to clear my head, the smell of diesel and salt and fried fish sticking to my clothes. From there, mountains didn't seem real. They were just shapes on the horizon, blue and soft and far away, like a painted backdrop someone had forgotten to roll up. But in Hannah's voice they were solid and close. She'd text me photos from her training hikes in the Cascades tree trunks, slick with moss switchbacks etched into gravel light, slanting through fir branches in thin silvery beams that looked almost sacred. A week before she left for Montana, we met for dinner at a small place in Ballard, with sticky wooden tables and the smell of garlic and grilled salmon drifting out from the kitchen. The floor creaked under your feet when you walked, and the front windows fogged up a little from the heat of the stove. She came in, late hair pulled back in a messy knot, a faint line of dirt still under one fingernail where she'd missed it washing up. There was a tiredness around her eyes that didn't have anything to do with work. When I asked if she was all right, she shrugged, poked at the condensation on her water glass, and said, "I just need quiet, Danny. Not city quiet, real quiet. The kind you feel in your chest." She said it lightly, but there was a weight to the words, like she was admitting more than she meant to. I remember the way she kept glancing toward the open front door, as if the night air coming in smelled different than it should have. She'd been to Glacier before shorter trips over the years, but this time she'd done her homework in a more methodical way. Her living room looked like the planning room for a small expedition. A large printed map of the park was taped to the wall, the folds deep and white where she'd opened and closed it too many times. Thin red lines traced the Iceberg Lake Trail, then curved across to the bird tunnel route and dropped into the more remote valleys beyond. On the coffee table, she had stacks of printed trip reports, each corner bent with handwritten notes in the margins. Steep here, bear activity. Bring micro spikes, if snow. The glow from a floor lamp threw everything into a soft amber light, and you could hear the refrigerator hum in the kitchen between sentences. Every now and then the old heater would kick on with a clank, though it wasn't cold enough for it to be working. Hannah would pause, listen, then go back to explaining where her camp would be each night, her finger tracing the contour lines on the map like she was already walking them. We'd grown up taking road trips with our parents through the Rockies and up into Montana, the four of us packed into a sedan that always smelled faintly of French fries and sunscreen. Back then, Glacier was an idea more than a place to me, a patch of white on a map, a postcard with bright blue water and sharp peaks taped to my bedroom wall. Hannah, even as a kid, had been different. She'd press her face to the glass when Dad drove us along mountain roads, eyes tracking the tree line, asking what was beyond each blind curve and distant ridge. Our parents used to joke that she'd move into a tent one day and forget where the nearest grocery store was. Somewhere along the line, the joke turned into truth. By the time she was in her mid-30s, though, we never said her age out loud in those exact numbers, she had a reputation in her circle for going deeper into the backcountry than most of her friends would always. Coming back with stories about sudden storms and quiet lakes and the way the stars looked when you were miles from the nearest power line. On the phone with our parents that week, I could hear the clink of dishes in the background, the soft drone of a TV game show turned down low. They were worried, of course, they always were when she headed off alone, but it came out sideways in little questions about her gear and whether her car had been serviced recently. My mother asked about her boots, whether the soles were still good, as if worn rubber was the real threat. My father, voice rough from age and old cigarettes, asked about weather reports and trail conditions like he understood them better than he did. Hannah handled it gently, walking them through her plan, her voice steady but warm. I could hear a smile in it, even through the static of the line. The call ended with the usual promises she'd check in when she could send a photo or two when she had signal, let them know when she was off the trail. None of us knew how heavy those casual promises would feel later. The night before she left, I drove over to her place with a six-pack and a bag of takeout. The car's headlights sweeping across her small front yard and catching on the overgrown lavender by the walkway. The air outside was warm, but carried a cool edge after dark, that faint mixture of exhaust, damp concrete, and distant salt water that always hangs over the city in late summer. Inside, her house smelled like fried rice, potting soil, and the lemon cleaner she'd used earlier on the counters. Her pack sat open on the couch, half filled with rolled clothes, a compact stove, a coil of rope, and the first aid kit she always carried. On the floor beside it, there was a neatly folded map and a small spiral notebook where she'd written her daily mileage goals in neat, blocky letters. I watched her drop a tiny hard-shelled container into an outer pocket, a little tin of beeswax she used on her boots, and for some reason, my eyes followed it longer than they should have. We ate in front of the coffee table, knees almost touching the TV off the only sound, the soft scrape of chopsticks against cardboard and the occasional car passing outside with a rush of tires on asphalt. She talked about the route again, but this time there was more in it, less logistics, more feeling. She described the way the light hits Iceberg Lake in the late afternoon, how the cliffs around it make the air feel cooler even when the sun is high. She mentioned a section of trail that always felt a little eerie to her, a narrow cut between rock walls where the breeze died and sounds seemed to get swallowed up before they reached your ears. "It's not bad," she said, shrugging it off, just quiet in a way that makes you pay attention. She said it with a half smile, but I remember a small pause after the word quiet, like she was tasting it, weighing it. The room felt briefly still, the refrigerator's low hum suddenly louder than it had been a moment before. When I left that night, the air outside had cooled enough that I could see the faintest cloud of my breath near the porch light. The bulb buzzed softly, drawing in a slow orbit of moths that tapped against the glass in dull, papery beats. Hannah walked me out to the curb, her bare feet making little slaps on the concrete path. We stood there a minute, our voices low, the neighborhood mostly quiet, except for a distant dog barking and the soft whoosh of a late bus a few blocks over. She hugged me tighter than usual, and I noticed the smell of her jacket fabric softener and a hint of campfire smoke from some trip earlier that summer she'd never fully told me about. As I pulled away, she rested her hand briefly on my arm like she wanted to say something else, then just shook her head and smiled instead. The next morning, while she was starting her drive east toward Montana, my day began with the familiar clatter of my coffee mug on the kitchen counter and the tinny sound of the news playing from the radio on top of the fridge. The announcer talked about heat waves in other parts of the country, about higher-than-normal temperatures in the Northwest, about unusual seasonal patterns in the Rockies, without going into much detail. I loaded the dishwasher, the faint smell of last night's garlic and soy sauce rising from the plates as the hot water hit them. It was just another workday to me, traffic a meeting that ran too long, the air in the conference room stale from too many bodies and not enough fresh air. I checked my phone once around mid-morning, saw no new messages from her, and put it back in my pocket. She was driving. No news meant she had both hands on the wheel, and that was fine. By late afternoon, clouds had started to build over the city, thin at first, and then thicker, a gray veil sliding in from the west. I cracked my office window an inch, and the smell of impending rain slipped inside, cool and metallic. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard the faint rumble of thunder, but it might have been a truck crossing one of the bridges. On my computer screen, a weather site showed a patchwork of radar colors creeping over the northern Rockies, but I didn't linger on it. I told myself she understood storms better than I did. On the drive home, wiper blades squeaked across dry glass for the first few miles before the drizzle finally came tapping on the windshield and blurring the brake lights ahead into soft red streaks. That evening I sat on my couch with the lamp turned low, the room lit in that soft golden way that makes everything feel smaller and safer than it is. The sliding door to the tiny balcony was cracked open just enough to let in the smell of wet pavement from the courtyard below, and the sound of rain was steady but light, a gentle hiss against the leaves of the maple tree outside. My phone was on the coffee table screen, dark, the faint reflection of the lamp shimmering across it. I remember glancing at the time and thinking she should be near the park by then, maybe already settling into a cheap motel or campground somewhere under a clearer sky than mine. I didn't want to bother her on the road, so I just sent a short text. "You good call or text when you land." Then I set the phone back down face up this time and watched the rain trace lines down the glass. Minutes stretched, the apartment grew quieter, and the little rectangle of black glass stayed stubbornly, innocently blank. The first sign that something was wrong came in a quiet, almost forgettable way, just a small vibration against the wood of my coffee table the morning after Hannah reached Montana. I was tying my shoes, getting ready for work, when I noticed a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. No voicemail, just the faint record of a ring I hadn't heard. I didn't think much of it at the time. Spam calls were as common as rain in Seattle. Still, I remember picking up the phone and feeling for a split second as though the air in the apartment shifted. The rain outside had left the windows striped and gray, turning the light in the room pale and thin. I brushed the feeling off and headed out the door, letting it close behind me with that soft latch I'd heard every morning for years. Most of that day moved like any other. Meetings, emails, the murmur of voices drifting through the hall as people passed my office. But every now and then, without meaning to, I'd glance at my lock screen. Nothing. No new messages, no photo from the road, no short text saying she'd stopped for gas or reached the park. I kept telling myself she was just focused on the drive, that the service out near the mountains was patchy, that she'd check in once she'd settled. But as evening came on, the quiet around her absence started to feel heavier than it should have, like a room where someone had stepped out only seconds before and forgotten to return. By the time the sun slipped behind the skyline, painting the glass towers orange and gold, a faint uneasiness had set in a thin thread pulling at the back of my mind. I sent another quick text, something simple. "Hope you made it. Let me know you're safe." I didn't stare at the phone afterward. I just set it on the kitchen counter while I made dinner, the sizzle of onions in the pan cutting through the stillness. But every few minutes I'd feel that subtle tug to check again. Nothing changed. The screen stayed dark, reflecting the overhead light like a small, unreliable mirror. My parents called later that night. My mother's voice came through soft and strained, the kind of tone she used when she didn't want to say exactly what she was thinking. "Have you heard from her?" she asked. I told her no, but I said it lightly, trying to bring some steadiness into the space between us. My father in the background asked whether Hannah would have reached the trailhead by then. He sounded casual, but there was a thinness to his voice, like he hadn't taken a full breath in a while. I reminded them that she usually texted late after she'd settled and that she might just be getting herself situated. We stayed on the phone a little too long, each of us repeating the same reassurances, until they sounded like lines from a script none of us believed in. The next morning, no message had come. My alarm buzzed in the dim gray light, and the room felt colder than usual. I sat up slowly, the sheets pulling away with a soft rustle, and checked my phone immediately. No calls, no texts, not even a stray alert. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint hum of my refrigerator in the next room and thinking, she always checks in. Even on her busiest days, she never left a full day behind without a word. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. Her voice, calm and bright, spilled through the speaker. "Hey, it's Hannah. Leave a message." It felt wrong hearing it then, wrong how normal it sounded. I went to work anyway. Habit can be a strange sort of refuge. But the unease followed me like a shadow threading itself into each moment. The hum of the office lights seemed louder, harsher. The tapping of keyboards sounded frantic, out of rhythm. I kept telling myself she'd simply lost service or forgotten to charge her phone, but that excuse didn't sit right. Hannah was never casual about that, especially before a long hike. Around noon, my phone buzzed, and for one breathless moment I hoped it was her. But it was my father, his voice tight. "Your mother's worried," he said. "She didn't sleep." I stepped out onto the balcony behind my office where the city noise faded to a distant rush and told him I'd try calling the park if we didn't hear something by the afternoon. He exhaled slowly, a tremor in it. "All right," he said, though it didn't sound like agreement, more like resignation. By late afternoon, the sky had turned to washed-out blue, thin clouds drifting over the Sound. I drove home through a light drizzle, watching droplets streak across the windshield. each one catching the fading light like small, fleeting sparks. Back in my apartment, I called her again, straight to voicemail. Then again, same thing. I felt a strange hollowness forming beneath my ribs, a slow, sinking pressure that didn't quite feel like panic, but something older, deeper. I called the motel where she sometimes stayed near the park. The clerk's voice was polite, but uncertain. There had been no guest by that name. "Maybe she camped," he suggested. "Lots of people do." His voice carried a small, forced optimism I didn't trust. I tried the ranger station next. A woman answered, her voice brisk and winded, as if she'd hurried in from outside. When I explained who I was and asked if anyone had checked in under my sister's name, I heard papers shuffling and the faint beep of a computer waking up. She couldn't confirm much, only that hikers heading out early sometimes didn't return calls right away. "Weather's been strange up here," she added. "Storms coming in fast." The line crackled softly like the sound of distant static or wind caught in wire. I thanked her and hung up, but the uncertainty in her voice stayed with me. That night, a deeper quiet settled over the apartment. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp chill in the air. I sat on the couch with the lamp dimmed low, the cord of my phone charger coiled neatly on the table beside me. I tried watching some mindless television, something bright and loud enough to drown out my thoughts, but the noise grated on me until I muted it. Every few minutes I'd check the screen again. Nothing. The glow from the streetlights outside filtered through the blinds, casting long horizontal shadows across the floor. Sometime after 9, I called my parents again. My mother answered on the first ring, her voice already thin with worry. "Daniel, this isn't right," she said. I could hear the tremor in her breath. My father took the phone a moment later. He cleared his throat, but the steadiness he tried to project didn't quite land. "Maybe her car broke down," he said, though the pause afterward told me he didn't believe it. I told them I'd try the ranger station once more, then see what else I could do in the morning. When I reached the station again, a different voice answered, deeper with a slower cadence. He confirmed that Hannah's permit had been registered early the previous morning. He spoke carefully, as if choosing each word deliberately. "She hasn't checked back in," he said, "but folks on multi-day routes don't always come out when expected." I asked whether a storm had hit the area. There was a pause, a rustle of movement near the receiver. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We had a rough one." Visibility dropped fast. The way he said it left a chill in me, a faint bite at the base of my spine. After the call, I walked to the sliding door and opened it, letting the night air drift into the apartment. It smelled of wet concrete and the faint tang of cedar from the trees below. Somewhere across the courtyard, a porch light hummed softly, casting a circle of pale yellow on the damp walkway. The silence stretched around me, thickening with each minute that passed. I tried to convince myself that she was fine, that she was sitting beside a campfire miles away, unaware of the worry building across state lines. But the more I told myself that story, the less believable it became. By the next morning, the quiet had deepened into something more pointed. My stomach felt tight, as if I'd swallowed something too heavy to digest. I called the ranger station again, and this time the man on duty sounded more alert, more cautious. "Her vehicle is still here," he said. "We checked the lot this morning." For a moment I didn't hear anything at all. Not his voice, not the faint rustle of traffic through my window, just a hollow ringing that seemed to echo inside my chest. I asked him to repeat it. "We found her car," he said. "It looks undisturbed." That word undisturbed fell like a stone. It meant she hadn't returned. It meant she hadn't driven away to find better signal or a warm room. It meant something had interrupted the normal rhythm of a trip she'd planned with such precision. I thanked him numbly and told him I'd be on the first flight I could manage. When I hung up, the apartment felt suddenly too small. The air too still. The refrigerator hummed softly, a steady, indifferent sound. I called my parents immediately. My mother started crying before I'd even finished explaining. My father, silent for a long stretch, finally whispered, "Go." Just that. Go. I packed a bag without really seeing what I was putting inside. Jean shirts, a jacket, travel-sized toiletries. My hands shook slightly as I zipped it closed. Outside, the sky had turned a colder shade of blue, the clouds stretched thin like worn fabric. A neighbor's dog barked once, sharp and distant, then fell quiet. The flight to Montana wasn't until late afternoon. Those hours waiting felt like moving through molasses, slow, thick, suspended. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee I barely touched, staring at my phone as if I could will it to ring. Once I thought I saw the screen light up and reached for it too quickly, knocking over the mug. The dark liquid spread across the table, warm against my fingertips. I didn't bother wiping it up right away. When the time finally came to leave for the airport, I stepped out into air that carried a faint bite cooler than it had been the day before. As I locked the door, I hesitated, my hand resting on the doorknob a heartbeat longer than necessary. The hallway felt unusually silent, the fluorescent lights above casting a washed-out glow along the carpet. I walked slowly to the elevator, each footstep muffled and strangely weightless. Hours later, after landing in Montana, I picked up my rental car and started the long drive toward the park. The road wound through stretches of open land, the fields pale under the evening light, the mountains rising in the distance like dark teeth against the horizon. The air coming through the cracked window was cool and smelled faintly of dust and pine. I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, even though it made no difference. By the time I reached the small motel near the park entrance, dusk had nearly settled. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, casting a dull pink glow across the gravel lot. I checked in quickly, my voice sounding far away to my own ears. Inside the room, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of old fabric softener and something metallic like cooled radiator pipes. I set my bag on the bed but didn't unpack. I just sat for a long moment on the edge of the mattress, elbows on my knees, hands clasped tightly enough that my knuckles whitened. There was a knock, then a slow, deliberate tap against the thin metal door. When I opened it, a sheriff's cruiser sat idling in the gravel headlights, pointed toward the darkening ridge beyond town. A deputy stood under the porch light, its buzz filling the quiet space between us. He removed his hat before speaking, his silhouette framed by the soft flickering glow. And in that simple gesture, the cold weight in my chest settled deeper, as if it already knew what the night was about to bring. The search began before dawn, long before most of the small towns around Glacier had even stirred awake. I remember stepping out of the motel room into air that cut straight through my jacket, a thin, sharp chill that carried the smell of damp asphalt and pine needles settling after the night. The horizon still held the last shape of darkness, but the parking lot was already alive with beams from headlights sweeping across gravel radios, crackling in clipped bursts, and deputies moving with the quiet urgency of people who know the first hours matter most. A sheriff's SUV idled near the office door, its engine humming low while a ranger truck pulled in beside it, tires crunching softly. The deputy who'd spoken to me the night before gave a small nod when our eyes met the brim of his hat, shadowing most of his face. Behind him, a ranger one I later learned was Kyle Benton, unrolled a large topographic map across the hood of his truck. The paper rippled in the cold breeze corners, held down by flashlight handles and a thermos of coffee that steamed faintly in the early light. For a moment, I stood at the edge of that scene, feeling like I'd stepped into something larger than I could understand. The night before, this had been about unanswered calls and my sister's silence. Now, it had shifted into something official, something that pulled in uniforms and protocols and clipped radio exchanges. I felt the ground tilt under that realization, a quiet slide from personal worry into the stark machinery of a search. We drove to the trailhead in a small caravan, 2 ranger trucks, a sheriff's cruiser, and my rental car at the back. The road wound through stands of dark trees, the headlights catching trunks and low brush in quick flashes. When we reached the parking area, the sky had grown pale enough to show outlines of the peaks beyond their ridges dusted in early light. Her car sat exactly where the ranger had said, parked neat and straight, a thin film of dust on the windshield. It looked too still, too untouched, like someone had placed it there and then stepped out of the world. I walked toward it slowly, the gravel shifting under my boots with each step. The cool morning air carried the scent of wet pine and distant glacier runoff, clean, cold, unmistakable. I pressed my hand to the hood of her Subaru. Cold. Not the cold of a few hours' rest, but the deeper cold of metal left untouched overnight. I felt something in me tighten. A ranger came up beside me, speaking gently, asking whether I recognized anything that seemed out of place, but the words barely registered. Inside the car, her water bottle sat upright in the cup holder. Her folded trail maps were tucked into the door pocket. Everything looked exactly as she would have left it, and that sameness made the silence around the car feel heavier. The deputies began their initial checks, circling the vehicle, jotting notes. They photographed the license plate, the tires, the ground around the frame. The rangers spread out scanning the tree line and the first stretch of trail. I heard snippets of conversation, weather reports, trail conditions, mentions of a storm that had blown in fast the day before. Someone said the wind up top had been strong enough to bend saplings. Another said visibility had dropped to almost nothing by late afternoon. Their voices were matter-of-fact, but the way they traded glances told a different story. Eventually, one of the rangers asked if I wanted to see the trail she'd signed out for. I nodded, and we walked a short distance to where the path rose between spruce trees, the ground damp and brown with needles. The air felt colder there, as if the forest still held last night's storm in its branches. I looked down that path, the narrow way her boots would have carried her, and felt a strange constriction in my throat. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, just the firm, quiet pressure of dread settling into place. The search teams arrived gradually that morning, more rangers, volunteers from nearby towns, a pair of dog handlers with 2 golden retrievers who bounced lightly on their leads, sniffing the cool air. They gathered at the trailhead while Kyle outlined the initial plan. They'd start with her intended route up toward Iceberg Lake, then across the ridge toward the tunnel. They'd sweep outward from the trail, checking ravines, ledges, and areas where the storm might have driven her off course. His voice was steady and clear, but there was a gravity in it, a weight that made every person there straighten just slightly. As the teams moved out, I stayed close to the command area where deputies had set up a temporary post from the back of a truck. The tailgate was open, forming a makeshift table with radios, printed maps, and a thermos that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. The radio chatter came in small bursts, voices cutting in and out with static as they reported positions and conditions. I watched each team disappear down different paths until the forest swallowed them, the sound of their boots fading beneath the soft rush of wind through the branches. The first hours passed with no findings, no calls that made anyone lean closer to the radio. Occasionally, someone would spot a shape on the ground, a scrap of paper, a glove, a piece of fabric. But each time it turned out to be from another hiker, lost trash or debris blown off the trail by the storm. More than once, the dogs caught a faint trace, their noses lifting tails, straightening only for the scent to fade abruptly near the lower switchbacks. One handler shook his head slowly and knelt beside his retriever, scratching behind its ears. "Wind must have scattered it," he murmured, but even he didn't sound convinced. Someone brought her notebook from the car to the command post. The cover was still stiff, the pages filled with neat lines from her hand, just small entries about weather and plans. Day 1, good. Light traffic. Perfect skies. Tomorrow through the tunnel. I stared at the words until they blurred the air around me, feeling thicker with every breath. By midday, clouds rolled back over the mountains, soft shadows falling across the valley. The temperature dropped and I shoved my hands deeper into my jacket pockets. Deputies returned periodically to update the map, marking off areas cleared. Each new red line felt like a door closing. The map became a pattern of checked boxes and crossed-out sections, the open spaces shrinking. The quiet around those marks settled into me like a cold stone. That afternoon, a helicopter circled the ridges above its blades, cutting through the thin mountain air with a deep thudding sound that echoed off the peaks. I craned my neck to watch it following its slow sweep along the cliffs. The wind from its path stirred the dust near the trailhead, sending a brief gritty gust against my face. But even from above they saw nothing. No movement on the rocks, no flash of bright fabric, no sign of a person who should have been back days ago. As word spread through the nearby towns, people began to arrive, locals who knew the trails. Fellow hikers who recognized her car, old-timers who'd lived their whole lives near those mountains. They approached quietly, hats in hand, voices low. Some asked what her route had been. Others just stood with us, offering presents more than words. There was a kind of collective stillness in those moments, as if everyone sensed the mountains holding something back. In the late afternoon, a volunteer came in from the North Ridge, his boots and jeans caked with mud. He carried something small in his gloved hand, a scrap of glossy paper half burned at the edges. He held it out carefully as if it might crumble. For a breath, every sound around the command post seemed to pause. The piece was so damaged it was hard to make out, but it looked like part of a photograph, a blurred image of a mountain goat on a rock, the kind of scene Hannah often captured. A murmur passed among the rangers, but the volunteer shook his head slowly. He'd found it pinned under a rock near a cliff face, but there were no footprints, no other signs nearby. No one could tell how long it had been there or whether the wind had carried it. It was both something and nothing at the same time, and that ambiguity stung more than if it had been meaningless. As evening crept in, the forest grew darker, shadows pooling between the trunks. The air smelled cold again, tinged with the faint scent of wet bark and distant snow. The teams returned one by one, their faces flushed from exertion and wind. They shook their heads as they approached the table, offering tired words. Clear nothing found no sign. The dogs, too, grew weary, their tails lower, their breathing heavier. Someone gave them water from a small metal bowl that clattered softly against the truck bed. I felt the exhaustion settling into my bones, but beneath it was something sharper, a quiet, gnawing fear that no one spoke aloud. The rangers exchanged looks when they thought I wasn't watching. The deputies kept their voices low. It wasn't panic, not yet, but it was the growing awareness that the usual explanations, wrong turn, twisted ankle, unexpected delay, were slipping away. What remained was harder, stranger, a sensation like standing at the edge of a deep ravine at night, unable to see the bottom. At one point, I stepped away from the command post and walked a few yards into the trees. The forest floor was soft underfoot, covered in damp needles and patches of old snow. The air was still, almost too still. The only sound my own breathing and the distant thump of the helicopter making one last pass. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the coolness of the shade settle on my skin. For just a second I imagined I could hear her laugh the way she'd say my name when she teased me, but it was just memory fragile and out of reach. When I returned to the clearing, the map had grown more crowded with marks. Kyle stood over it, arms crossed, his face drawn tight. A deputy pointed to a narrow section of trail near the upper ridge, a place where the storm had supposedly hit hardest. Their voices were too soft for me to hear the words, but the tension in their shoulders told the story. They were trying to understand a path that didn't add up, tracks erased by snow winds strong enough to twist the search in unpredictable directions, a storm that had arrived too quickly and left too quietly. As the light faded, casting the mountains in deep purples and blues, a fresh chill rose from the ground. I rubbed my hands together, the cold settling deep into my fingers. Most of the volunteers had gone home by then, but a few lingered, standing in small clusters near the trucks. Someone handed out cups of coffee that steamed in the cool air, the scent rich and grounding. Just as the Rangers began discussing the next day's plan, a faint burst of static came over the radio, followed by a short clipped transmission. The deputy holding the receiver straightened slightly, tilting his head to listen. The others fell quiet, their attention narrowing to that crackling voice. He didn't say anything at first, just listened, his brow tightening, his fingers tapping lightly against the radio's metal casing. Then he looked up, meeting Kyle's eyes across the table. He gestured toward a section of the map, his voice low enough that I couldn't catch the words. But something in the angle of his posture, the way the others leaned in, told me the search had shifted. Not a discovery. Not yet. But a hint, some detail that didn't belong where it was found. And as they marked a new spot on the map with a red circle, the last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge, leaving us standing in a deepening blue that felt heavier than the night before. The shift came quietly at first, the kind of change you don't notice until the air around you tightens. We were gathered near the trailhead again, the sun still low, the light thin and gray as it filtered through the high branches. A faint breeze carried the scent of cold rock and wet needles. Rangers were studying the map on the truck hood, murmuring over the next grid sections when the radio on Kyle's hip cracked with a sharper tone than anything we'd heard in days. The voice on the other end was clipped, breathless words tumbling fast enough that Kyle had to ask him to slow down. I watched the color drain from his face in a way that made my stomach drop before I heard a single detail. He turned slightly from the group, listened hard, then gave a short nod. I felt more than saw. Moments later, he called for everyone to clear space around the truck. Deputies converged, boots thudding on the hard ground, radios buzzing with overlapping transmissions. They marked a new point on the map with a thick red X far north of where we'd focused, a place none of us had seen yet. When Kyle finally spoke, his voice carried a tension that left no room for doubt. "We've got something." That was all he said. But the weight of those words hit me square in the chest. They wouldn't let me ride with the first team heading out. Liability protocol words that sounded thin and fragile compared to the dread rising in my throat. I followed in the second vehicle, sitting between two volunteers who kept their eyes down as if looking at me might break something none of us could fix. The road narrowed as we climbed, the tires grinding over patches of grit and half-melted snow. Sunlight flickered through the trees in fast, trembling slashes. My palms were damp. Every switchback carried a new silence that only deepened the higher we went. When we finally stopped near the start of a narrow ridge, the cold hit me first, sharp, biting, and strangely sweet, like wind rolling off a block of ice. The air tasted metallic. Rangers were already spreading out, ducking under low branches, moving with a precision that made it clear they knew exactly what they were searching for now. Their voices carried in short bursts, distance markers, notes on terrain, reminders to watch footing. I followed Kyle and a deputy up a steep incline where loose shale shifted under our boots. The higher we climbed, the colder it grew, as if the mountain itself exhaled frost. The call came again, urgent, unmistakable, cutting through the static like a wire snapping. We found a cavity. Those few words echoed between the ridges carried on the wind. I felt my legs move without instruction, following the group as they pushed toward the sound. The path narrowed to a slanted ledge where the stone was slick beneath a thin crust of ice. A rope line had already been anchored between two stunted pines. Beyond it, the ground dropped into a pale blue crack in the glacier, wide enough for a person to slip into, angled steeply like a frozen throat leading down into the mountain. I watched one ranger kneel at the opening, his breath fogging in the cold air. The flashlight beam he cast inside disappeared almost immediately into blackness. Another ranger clipped into the rope and eased his body into the crack, descending slowly. His boots scraped against the ice in small, controlled steps. The radio on his vest crackled faintly as he sank deeper out of sight. All we could hear then was the faint drip of meltwater somewhere below, echoing up like distant taps against glass. The seconds stretched. Then his voice came through, low and steady but strained at the edges. "You're going to want to get a medic down here. And a camera." The echo of it hung in the cold air, and even the wind seemed to pause. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my gums. Kyle put a hand on my shoulder, not to steady me, but to hold me back. It was the most human gesture I'd seen from him since the search began, and the quiet firmness in it told me everything. Something waited down there that no one had prepared me for. More ropes were anchored. The team moved with grave efficiency, lowering 2 more rangers into the darkness. The radios carried fragments, measurements, descriptions of footing, muttered instructions. Then finally, a phrase that froze the entire ridge. "We've got a chamber." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to force breath into my lungs. The cold had crept through my jacket and settled along my spine, making my hands shake despite myself. When they pulled the first ranger back up, his face was pale beneath the rim of his helmet. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He just stepped aside, shaking ice from his gloves while another ranger whispered something to Kyle that made him flinch almost imperceptibly. A medic was lowered next, then a deputy with an evidence bag sealed against the cold. It felt like hours before they decided to bring me closer, though I knew it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. They didn't let me see inside the shaft, not fully, but they let me stand near the edge while one of the deputies described what they'd found. His breath came out in trembling clouds as he spoke. The grotto below, he said, was larger than expected, a kind of hollowed-out chamber carved naturally by centuries of melt and freeze. But nothing about what they found inside was natural. "Your sister," he said quietly, was there. I don't remember the next few seconds clearly. It felt as if all sound drained out of the world, no wind, no crackle of radios, no rhythmic drip from the ice below. Just a dense, absolute stillness. I only recall the sensation of my knees softening and Kyle catching my elbow, steadying me while the cold air pressed in around us. The deputy continued in a soft, steady voice, explaining that she had been placed on a flat slab of stone in the center of the cavern. Her body, they said, was intact, frighteningly intact, preserved in a way none of them had seen before. A thick, amber-like coating wax they believed covered her skin from head to toe, glossy and unmoving under the lanterns they'd lowered. Her arms were positioned gently across her chest. Her expression was peaceful, almost serene. They had not found signs of struggle. They had not found wounds. They had not found anything that looked like violence. But something was wrong. Something deeply, unfathomably wrong. Around the stone surface were small objects laid out with care, carved figurines, bits of wood feathers, and slabs of stone etched with symbols no one recognized. Near her hands they found a small, horn-shaped amulet smoothed by touch. The medic had whispered that the wax still held the faint scent of honey and smoke, as though whoever had prepared her had done so with a ritualistic purpose. The chamber smelled of beeswax, warmed by lantern heat, of cold stone, of stillness, older than any of us. As they described the scene, something inside me felt like it cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a small internal snap that left everything numb. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight and dry, my jaw locked. All I could see was the image they were painting my sister lying there in that impossible stillness, preserved by hands I did not know, in a place no one should have found. The revelation unfolded piece by piece, each detail falling like a heavy stone. She had not died from violence. The early assessment, cold exhaustion, still held. The storm likely took her life before anyone ever found her. But what happened after? That belonged to someone else's world. Someone living far from the reach of roads or headlines or ordinary logic. Whoever found her carried her body into that chamber, placed her with deliberate care, preserved her so completely it defied every expectation. Whether they saw her as sacred or as a sign or as something to protect, we didn't know yet. When they finally brought her up, sealed in a thick insulated capsule lifted by helicopter, I stood back wrapped in the thin mountain air, watching rotor blades send snow and grit swirling around us. The noise was deafening, but I barely heard it. A ranger stood beside me, head bowed slightly, hat held in his hands. Another rested a hand on my shoulder for just a heartbeat before stepping away. Their compassion was quiet, steady, but it felt distant like voices through thick glass. My parents were contacted immediately. I stayed nearby listening as Kyle spoke to them over the satellite phone, his voice low and careful. My mother's cry carried faintly even through the static, a raw, breaking sound that tore through me more sharply than the cold. My father's silence on the other end was somehow worse, a silence that felt like a collapse. By the time we returned to the sheriff's office that evening, the sun had long since dropped behind the ridge, leaving the sky a deep blue fading into black. The air outside smelled faintly of diesel from the generator mixed with the distant scent of pine. Inside, people moved quietly between rooms, setting up lights, rolling in equipment, preparing statements. Every surface felt too bright, too sterile. They led me into a small conference room where coffee sat in a metal carafe untouched and cooling. Papers lay spread across the table, and a deputy wrote notes in a slow, careful hand. Someone else prepared the space for a press briefing. Microphones checked chairs, set out a podium, moved into place. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence, steady and relentless. I sat in a metal chair, hands clasped tightly, the cold still sitting heavy in my bones. There was no going backward now. No possibility, however faint, that she was still wandering somewhere on a trail waiting to be found. The truth had surfaced cold and impossible and final. And as I stared at the door, hearing footsteps move past in the hallway, I knew this night was only the beginning of everything that would follow: the explanations, the questions, the search for meaning in something that defied the world we understood. I drew a long breath, slow and unsteady, bracing myself for what waited on the other side of that door. By the time I stepped out of that conference room, evening had settled over the station like a heavy quilt, muting the sharp edges of everything around us. The lights inside hummed with that faint fluorescent buzz, casting a pale glow across tables crowded with reports, radios, and styrofoam cups gone soft from the heat of old coffee. People moved carefully, voices, low footsteps measured as if the building itself had become sacred ground. No one said it out loud, but we were all trying to make sense of the same impossible truth: my sister had been found in a place where no one should have been preserved, in a way no one could explain, surrounded by objects that didn't belong to the world most of us knew. Law enforcement secured the mountain quickly. A federal team arrived within hours, their trucks rolling into the lot, with engines humming in the cold air. They brought equipment I'd never seen before: sealed cases, thermal scanners, protective gear that glinted under the parking lot lights. They moved with quiet purpose, acknowledging me with brief nods as they passed. The sheriff guided me into a small room away from the bustle, its walls lined with old maps and faded photos of past search efforts. The vinyl chair crackled under me when I sat. He explained gently but firmly that the site had to be treated like a crime scene until they understood what had happened. His voice never rose above a calm, steady cadence, but there was a gravity in his eyes I'll never forget. I called my parents next. The signal cut in and out, static, riding beneath every word, but they heard enough. My mother's voice broke. It was a sound I'd never heard from her before, a soft, keening tremor that made my own throat tighten. My father, usually the anchor in moments like this, stayed silent for a long stretch before finally speaking. His voice was low, worn, as though the effort of forming each word cost him something he didn't have to spare. "They would fly out," he said. "First plane in the morning." After the call ended, I sat with the phone still pressed to my ear for several seconds, feeling the cold plastic against my skin, breathing in slow, uneven breaths. The next few days moved with an almost unnatural clarity. Federal agents interviewed everyone involved in the search, mapping timelines, cross-checking weather reports, and revisiting every inch of the ridge where the initial clue appeared. The station filled with a mixture of crisp uniforms and rumpled jackets worn by locals who had volunteered. The smell of wet wool and cold air clung to everyone who came in from the mountains. I stood back as they worked, watching as photos were pinned to corkboards, images of the ice shaft, diagrams of the chamber below, sketches of the objects found near her. The amulet they'd recovered was sealed inside a case resting on soft foam, its smooth horned surface reflecting the overhead lights. Even behind glass, it felt out of place, like something carrying more history than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The community reacted in waves. In town the next morning, as I walked to a small cafe to meet my parents, people stepped aside gently, like I was carrying something fragile inside me. A few touched my arm or nodded with quiet sympathy. The woman behind the counter set down our coffees without charging us, her hands trembling just enough that the cups rattled on the table. Word had spread quickly, and though no one knew the full details yet, the strangeness of it all hung over the valley like a low, unmoving cloud. Folks talked in hushed tones. Old stories about the high country tales passed down through families about gatherings deep in the mountains, lights seen where no trails existed. The kind of stories people share only when something real has cracked the surface of their normal lives. As investigators pieced things together, they reached an unsettling conclusion: nothing criminal had been done to her. The storm had taken her life. The cold had stopped her heart before anyone reached her. What happened afterward? Her being carried into that cavern, placed on that smooth slab preserved with meticulous care, was the work of people who still lived far beyond the edges of modern society, a group that believed her death had meaning, a group that believed they were honoring her by keeping her safe in their own way. Those were the words the agents used honoring her. It didn't land easily, not then. Maybe it never fully has. There were no arrests, no trials, no charges filed. The people in that hidden valley, quiet, gentle, living a life untouched by technology or news, weren't seen as murderers. They hadn't killed her. They'd preserved her. That distinction didn't bring comfort, but it brought clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, is a kind of mercy. The federal team spent days in the valley documenting everything: structures, symbols, journals, even the way smoke curled from the fire pits outside their huts. The residents cooperated, answering questions in soft voices, explaining their beliefs with a kind of calm conviction that left the agents unsettled. But nothing pointed to violence. Nothing pointed to guilt. In the weeks that followed, routines shifted in ways that felt both subtle and monumental. Trails near the ridge were closed indefinitely. Signs went up warning hikers of unstable ice, though everyone knew that wasn't the real reason. Rangers patrolled the area more frequently, their radios crackling through the woods like distant insects. The town grew quiet. Even the usual summer chatter felt muted, like the mountains themselves had drawn in a long breath and held it. Back home in Seattle, I found myself moving through each day with a kind of practiced slowness. Little things took on new weight. The smell of rain on the pavement outside my apartment, the faint buzz of my refrigerator in the early morning, the way the late afternoon sun slid across the floor in thin golden bands. I caught myself looking at maps more often. Old trail charts, satellite images following the lines she once walked, trying to understand what she might have seen in those final hours. My parents coped in their own ways. My mother started keeping fresh flowers on the kitchen table, changing them out every few days. My father began walking the neighborhood at dawn, as if starting each day moving forward on foot might soften something inside him. There were times when I'd sit in my living room long after sunset, the city lights twinkling through the blinds, and I'd feel her presence in small, quiet ways. Not as a ghost or anything supernatural. More like the echo of a familiar rhythm, her laugh, when she caught me mispronouncing a plant name, the soft brush of her jacket sleeve when she hugged me goodnight, the way she paused before describing a place she loved. Those moments would hit without warning. A scent, a sound, the way a shadow fell across a trail during one of my own hikes months later. It was like she had woven herself into the world around me, leaving reminders stitched into the ordinary. Over time, I learned to carry the story of what happened to her in a way that didn't crush me. It didn't get lighter, not exactly, but it settled into a shape I could live with. I learned that peace isn't a single moment. It's a slow, uneven process, something you circle back to again and again until it feels a little less foreign. I learned that the mountains don't care about the lines we draw between reason and mystery. They hold their own truths, deep and old, shaped by forces larger than any of us. And I learned that love doesn't end at the boundary of understanding. It keeps going even when the trail disappears and the terrain turns strange beneath your feet. There's one image that stays with me. It came from a ranger who'd been in the cavern the day they found her. He told me quietly that the lantern light had made the wax on her skin glow just a little like she was caught in the first moment of dawn. He said she looked peaceful, not lost, not afraid. Peaceful. I hold on to that. In all the years since, through all the silence that followed, that small, soft truth has stayed with me like a steady hand at my back. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.